Georgia Williams was born in Shropshire, England on September 7, 1995. She was an intelligent, caring, and bubbly girl. She had a loving and tight-knit home life and was incredibly close to her family. She lived with her father Stephen, a police officer, her mother Lynette, and her older sister Scarlett. Georgia was a straight-A student, head girl at her school, and was a cadet in the Air Training Corps, hoping one day to become a Royal Air Force paramedic. She loved playing sports and being outside, and there was nothing she wouldn't try. Described as having an infectious personality and smile, she was a very popular 17-year-old who was adored by those who knew her. As soon as she became old enough to work, Georgia took on a part-time job at a local petrol station and quickly made friends with her colleagues. Among this group of friends was 23-year-old Jamie Reynolds. He had been in her sister Scarlett's year at school and was a little older than Georgia. Her family had met him on an occasion working at the petrol station and described him as quiet and polite. Reynolds would develop a liking for Georgia, making his feelings very apparent. Although Georgia didn't share the same feelings and rejected his advances, it didn't deter her from spending time with him. She remained polite and friendly. Georgia, being the person she was, continued to spend time with Reynolds and always made sure he was included. Having been bullied as a young girl, she knew the feeling of being an outcast all too well. And being the empath she was, never wanted to cause someone the same pain by ignoring them. Reynolds worked full-time at the petrol station and told Georgia he had a keen interest in photography and wanted to try and pursue it as a career instead of what he was currently doing. Georgia encouraged him, as did all her friends, and offered to help wherever she could. He asked her if she wouldn't mind modeling for some photographs with the intent of using them in his portfolio, which she gladly agreed to do. They made a plan for her and some of her friends to go to Jamie's parents' house on May 26, 2013 for a photo shoot. At around 7:30 p.m., Georgia left the family barbecue and headed out to meet Jamie and her friends, telling her family she would be back later. Always responsible and reliable, and as Jamie's house was only a few minutes away on foot, her parents agreed. A few hours later, and with no sign of Georgia, her mother Lynette sent her a text message asking her how everything was going and when they could be expecting her home. She got a message back saying that although the photo shoot had finished, she would be staying with her friends for a while longer and didn't know when she would be home. She put her usual 3 kisses at the end of the message. Lynette woke up at around 6 a.m. on Monday morning and went to check on her daughter, but upon seeing her bed untouched, she was concerned as to why she hadn't come home. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. She sent another message asking where she was, to which she received a response a few hours later, saying that she had lost track of time, stayed at her friend's, and forgot to message to let her know. The message ended by saying, "My battery is dying too." This was not a common thing for Georgia to do. She didn't ever want to cause people to worry and never failed to let her family know where she was. She was due to go to a music festival and take her first driving lesson, and her parents knew that missing those 2 things was a concerning sign. As it got to Tuesday morning, no one had heard anything from Georgia in almost 2 days. It was at this point that her parents really started to panic. They began to ring around her friends to see if she had stayed at their house overnight, but none of her friends had seen or heard from her. Her phone was now going straight to voicemail. Her boyfriend Matthew made a desperate appeal on Facebook, and word quickly began to spread that she was missing. Her parents went straight to the police. The only information they had was that she had spent her evening with Jamie Reynolds. When the police ran a quick routine background check on Reynolds, they immediately became concerned. In 2008, when he was 17 years old, Reynolds was given a final warning for attempting to strangle a 16-year-old girl he had lured into false pretenses of helping her with a project. The youth offending team and mental health services made visits to Reynolds to assess the situation further. His parents had told the team he had an obsession with violent pornography and snuff films, picked in rape and asphyxiation. They also said they had found several disturbing pictures of girls in school uniforms. He had drawn over them and put nooses around their necks. The teams individually determined that he posed a significant risk, but unfortunately the police took no further action, believing the case had been, in their words, suitably resolved. A few years later in 2011, Reynolds was put on the police radar once again when he purposely ran into a colleague's car after she rejected him romantically, but as no checks were made at the time, the link to the 2008 case was not made. Using CCTV and number plate recognition, Reynolds and his van were spotted at a cheap hotel almost 300 miles away in Glasgow, Scotland. Worryingly, there was no sign of George Williams. He was spotted in a car park making a quick change of clothes next to his van. Shropshire police contacted Police Scotland and he was taken in for questioning. He maintained he knew nothing of George's whereabouts, but the police were not satisfied with this. With knowledge of his background, he was arrested and brought back to Shropshire for further questioning. The Reynolds were still saying nothing and denying all the allegations. The next morning at around 5:30 a.m., senior police officers knocked on the Williams' front door. Her parents said that they instantly knew that their beautiful daughter was no longer alive. The team headed back to her last known location, the Reynolds house, to do a thorough and in-depth search. What they stumbled upon horrified even the most experienced and tenured of officers. They found Reynolds' camera in the house that contained a memory card. It was clear that someone had tried to wipe what was on it. Fortunately for the officers, they hadn't succeeded. But with this, the horrific, sickening picture of what had happened to Georgia Williams began to unfold. The pictures showed that Georgia had been forced onto a box with a noose around her neck. Reynolds had kicked the box from under her and hanged her. She was photographed like this all over the house, and after he was done, he raped her dead body, which she also photographed. With this, Reynolds was charged, but he refused to tell them where Georgia's body was. Detective Sergeant Hopwood, who was assigned to assist in the case, described him as someone playing games. The police began to formulate a timeline of Reynolds' movements in the days after Georgia's disappearance, and CCTV would play a vital role in adding to their case. A day after Georgia went missing, he was spotted on camera filling up his van with fuel. Little did anyone know at the time, but Georgia was already dead and her body was in the back of the van. After he killed her, he drove 60 miles to Wrexham in Wales, where he stopped to watch a film at a cinema. He watched one of the Fast and Furious films, the same movie he had been trying to persuade George to go and watch with him. With Reynolds already in custody, the police asked the public for their help. A number of people came forward to tell police they had in fact helped Reynolds at the side of the road when his van had gotten stuck. As soon as the police heard the location, they knew that they would soon find George. On the 31st of May, 5 days after she had gone missing, they found the body of George Williams. She was naked and barely hidden in a woodland area near Wrexham. Jamie Reynolds was officially charged with murder, however it was uncertain as to how he would plead in court. On December 2, 2013, he appeared at Stafford Crown Court. George's father Stephen said he watched Reynolds before he entered the courtroom as he laughed and joked, showing no remorse or care for the destruction he had caused. But before he entered the courtroom, his demeanor quickly changed to almost meek and childlike. Pled guilty to murder, much to the relief of George's family. On December 19th, he was given the harshest sentence possible under British criminal law, a whole life order, meaning he would never be released from prison. He became one of the youngest people in British criminal history to receive this sentence. Mr. Justice Wilkes said, "The sentence I pass on is one of life imprisonment. The early release provisions are not to apply to you. I make a whole life order." Reynolds appealed his sentence in 2014, but the Court of Appeals said there was no possible way a whole life order could be argued against and the sentence was just. His appeal was flatly denied. An investigation into how Jamie Reynolds' previous attacks on women were handled by the police was carried out, and subsequently 6 police officers from the West Mercia Police were served with misconduct notices regarding the 2008 case. The memory of Georgia Williams was honored by the local community as they raised more than £2,000 for a memorial bench to be made for her. Her family also started the Georgia Williams Trust, a charity which helps young people pursue their passions and dreams with the helps of grants and partnerships, a fitting tribute for the passionate, vibrant, and spirited Georgia Williams. Jessica Lloyd was a popular 27-year-old. She had a close-knit family and circle of friends who adored her. Bright and friendly, she enjoyed nothing more than socializing and being with the people she loved and cared about. Her brother described her as vivacious and outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with best friends. She lives alone in Ontario, just off Highway 37, in a house set back from the road. She was just a normal, 20-something Canadian with her whole life ahead of her. On the 28th of January 2010, Jessica sends a text message to her friend wishing them a good night. She had to be in bed early as she was due at work the next day. The following morning, her mother found out she hadn't arrived at work. Jessica was extremely reliable and would never fail to turn up without a reason. Panicking, her mother called Andy Lloyd, Jessica's brother, and when he confirmed that he too hadn't heard from her, alarm bells began to ring. He went straight to Jessica's house just off Highway 37. When he arrived, nothing seemed out of place. Everything was where it was meant to be. Her ID was where she'd left it and her keys hadn't been moved. It was then that Andy called 911. Officers were quick to arrive on scene and they too were stumped by Jessica's sudden disappearance. They searched the house for any clues as to where she might have gone but could find nothing obvious. News of Jessica's disappearance quickly began to spread. When they saw the emergency services surrounding Jessica's house, a pair of local men were reminded of something they had seen the night before. They had been driving down Highway 37, right past Jessica Lloyd's home. They noticed an SUV parked in a field behind her house. They instantly knew there could be a connection and so went straight to the police. Canadian winters are notoriously brutal. The temperature plummets and snow covers the landscape for up to 7 months of the year in some places. This would prove to work in the police's favor. Due to the freezing conditions, they were able to find tire tracks and boot prints in the field where the men had seen the car. The cold had preserved them and they were still in perfect condition. The police finally had a lead. The Ontario Provincial Police set up roadblocks and extensive canvassing around the area to try and find a car with similar treads. Numerous cars came and went and the police were having no luck. On the 4th of February, Colonel Russell Williams was driving his Nissan Pathfinder on Highway 37 when he was pulled over for an inspection of his tires. He was allowed to go on his way, but little did he know that from that moment on he would be under constant police surveillance. As they were investigating the disappearance of Jessica Lloyd, the police were also trying to find the culprit behind a string of disturbing and bizarre cases. Tweed, Ontario is midway between Toronto and Ottawa. It's small with a population of just over 5,000 people, but it's friendly, it's safe, and has a close-knit community. Beginning in 2007, Tweed would be the epicenter of a series of break-ins and burglaries over the next few years. In January 2009, a family returned from a trip to Toronto. Their teenage daughter went upstairs to unpack and noticed that her underwear had gone from her drawers, her bathing suits had disappeared, and photos of her had been removed from the family albums. Police were able to find a DNA sample in her bedroom and the family's life would be forever changed. Their daughter was not allowed to go anywhere by herself and she felt unsafe being in her own bedroom. Larry Jones was a resident of Tweed. He lived on Cozy Cove Lane and was an active member of the community, loving nothing more than going hunting and taking long walks in the area. One day he received a panic call from his daughter saying that she had disturbed an intruder inside her home. No matter what the police tried, the break-ins kept happening, but they would soon take a far more frightening turn. On September 17th, a young mother was asleep with her baby. She was awoken by an intruder who over the course of the next few hours would subject her to a horrific and prolonged sexual assault, leaving her terrified and traumatized. Soon another woman would be attacked in nearly identical circumstances. She was awoken by a man who tied her up and attacked her over the next 2.5 hours. She asked if he was going to kill her and he replied saying there was no need for that. She recognized his voice but couldn't work out why. She would later guess that it was the voice of Larry Jones. The police were quick to arrest Larry, believing they had their suspect in custody. The police searched his home, interrogated him for hours, and made him take a 3-hour-long polygraph test. After weeks of follow-up, they told him he was no longer a suspect. The investigators were back to square one. On the road from Tweed to Belleville stands an old farmhouse. In November, the resident arrived home to get ready for her birthday party. Upon entering her bedroom, she noticed that her bedside drawers were open and some personal items were missing. Her neighbor arrived to take her to the party and they debated on calling the police but ultimately decided against it. Before they left, they checked that the kitchen door was bolted. When she arrived home the next day, she went upstairs to use her photocopier and her neighbor heard her screaming. Her old computer that she rarely used had been turned on and the screensaver had been disabled. In large letters, someone had typed, "Go ahead. Call the police." Whoever had left the note had been hiding in the house the day before when she thought she was alone getting ready for her party. They'd unlocked the kitchen door and gone out the back. Her drawers had once again been emptied. The break-in was investigated by the Belleville police. They were unaware of the events that were going on in Tweed. During 2008 and 2009, there were 34 break-ins and break-in attempts in the area. Thanks for watching. It has over 4,000 men and women assigned there, and in July 2009, Colonel Russell Williams took command. During his youth, he was a notorious prankster who was popular amongst his friendship group, and despite his outward confidence, he never spoke about himself or his background. He was a child of divorce who spent most of his time in boarding school and as a result had little contact with his family. During his time as a student, he only had one girlfriend, but the relationship ended acrimoniously, was heartbroken. He remained single for the rest of his 20s before he married his wife, Marie Elizabeth. Despite his time studying economics at university, he decided he needed a change and was going to join the Air Force. He quickly rose up the ranks and was a model officer. His colleagues said he was incredibly bright, extremely methodical, and unusually calm. Whilst he had living quarters on the base, he and his wife owned a property in Tweed which they purchased 5 years before, and to get to it, they had to drive down Highway 37. Their idyllic cottage was on Cozy Cove Lane, next door to Larry Jones. A few months before Jessica went missing, he'd asked Larry where he liked to go hunting. Larry explained he usually went to the wooded area where East Hungerford and Cary Road met. His wife lived mostly in Orleans and worked in Ottawa as a charity executive. As part of his job in the military, he would fly transport planes to natural disasters and war zones alongside flying high-ranking officials and prominent figures. He was even in charge of the flights for Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip during their state visit to Canada in 2005. One of his fellow officers based at Trenton was Corporal Murray France Como. In contrast with the order and discipline of military life, Mary France was a free spirit, very artistic and bohemian. In 2009, a few months before Jessica Lloyd vanished, Mary France arrived home from flying with the Prime Minister Stephen Harper during his visit to the Far East. She excitedly told her ex-boyfriend that she had flown around the world. 3 days later, people grew concerned as they hadn't heard from her. When the police went to check her home, they found her body. As the death had been caused by strangulation, it was initially ruled as a suicide, but this was quickly changed to murder. Mary France's distraught family received a letter of condolence from the Trenton commander, Colonel Russell Williams. On February 7th, 4 days after his car had been stopped by the police, Williams was at the new house that he and his wife had recently moved into when he got a call from investigators. They wanted to know if he could come down to the station to answer some questions. When Williams left, he told his wife he would be back for dinner. And that Sunday, just before 3 p.m., he arrived at Ottawa Police Service Headquarters. Leading the interview was Detective Sergeant Jim Smith, a veteran of the Behavioral Sciences Unit with a wealth of knowledge and experience under his belt. Detective Sergeant Smith knew he would have to call upon all his skill and patience in order to get Williams to talk. Smith made sure to make it clear to Russell that it was not just the disappearance of Jessica Lloyd they were looking at, but also the death of Murray France Como and the 2 sexual assaults in Tweed, and that they were also aware of his connection to the victims. To the death of Corporal Marie France Como and Williams's connection to her. Smith knew the evidence linking Williams to these unsolved crimes would continue to mount, and so put the pressure on Williams to provide them with more. Turning up the pressure again, Detective Sergeant Smith brought up a piece of evidence that Williams couldn't ignore: the tire tracks outside Jessica Lloyd's house. After this, it was time for Russell Williams to submit a fatal mistake. As the pressure on Williams continued to mount, Smith knew it would only be a matter of time before they would have the answers they were looking for. After talking about what he had done to Jessica Lloyd, Detective Sergeant Smith took Williams back to the previous November, the night that he murdered Corporal Mary France Como. Now Smith took Williams back to where it all began, the 2 unsolved sexual assaults. Colonel Russell Williams had entered Ottawa Police Service Headquarters as a distinguished military officer, a happily married man, and a model Canadian citizen. He left in handcuffs as a confessed serial rapist and double murderer. The confession of Russell Williams sent shockwaves throughout Canada. When searching his house on Cozy Cove Lane, the police found yet more evidence: numerous pieces of underwear that he had stolen, as well as things he would take with him when he went hunting for his next victim. On October 18, 2010, Russell Williams pled guilty to all charges against him, including rape, forcible confinement, and murder. He also pled guilty to 82 separate break-ins. His pedophilic tendencies were also unveiled as he admitted to stealing the underwear of girls as young as 9 years old. 3 days later, Williams was sentenced to 2 life terms for murder, 2 10-year sentences for sexual assault, 2 10-year sentences for forcible confinement, and 82 one-year sentences for breaking and entering. He will have to serve a minimum of 25 years in prison before he can even be considered for parole. The Governor-General of Canada stripped Williams of his title and medals, and he was expelled from the Canadian Armed Forces. His commission scroll was shredded, his uniform was burned, and his medals were cut into pieces. The devastation caused by the actions of Russell Williams is both far-reaching and immeasurable. The shattered friends and family of Jessica Lloyd and Murray Franz Como were consumed by grief. Those left behind will never fully recover from the damage he caused, and they also determined that Jessica Lloyd and Corporal Murray Franz Como will never be forgotten. Alice Poppy Madeline Gross was born on Valentine's Day 2000 in London, England. She lived in Hanwell with her sister Nina and parents Rosalind and Jose. She was incredibly creative and had a keen eye for art and design. She loved music and singing, could play the piano and violin, and would often write and perform her own songs. On the August 28, 2014 at around 3 p.m. she left her house to go for one of her usual walks down by the river. She told her parents she would be back by 6. She regularly did this and always kept to her time. Later in the day, she texted her father to say she was on her way home and wouldn't be long. Alice was so vigilant with her timekeeping that at 7 p.m. came round and she still wasn't home despite sending the text message. Her parents knew instinctively that something was deeply wrong. Her phone wasn't ringing anymore, and this only heightened her parents' concerns. Alice was only 14 and had been diagnosed with anorexia and depression. And although she and her family were seeking treatment, her parents were terrified that maybe she had collapsed somewhere. They reported her missing straight away. Between the police and Alice's family and friends, they began to search the area where they knew she would have been walking, but found nothing. Detective Superintendent Carl Metter was assigned to the case and was immediately concerned. The investigation was moving fast and quickly reached the media, and before long, witnesses were coming forward to report individual sightings of her. Using this information, the police were able to track down the relevant CCTV footage which confirmed these sightings. Just before 4 p.m., she was picked up on camera walking along the Grand Union Canal, then at a location called the Brentford Lock, not far from where she lived. She was spotted again at 4:26 p.m. walking along the canal under bridge called Trompersway, heading back in the direction of her home in Hanwell. But after this, there were no more sightings of her. A few days later, and with still no leads, her family made a desperate appeal. Realizing the case needed more than just a local search, Detective Superintendent Mehta turned the case over to Scotland Yard's Homicide and Major Crime Squad for it to be escalated. The public quickly mobilized to try and help find her. The hashtag Find Alice was being used all over social media. Voluntary searches were being conducted morning, noon, and night. And traditional yellow ribbons were placed all over the town to draw more attention and awareness for the missing girl. On the 4th of September, almost a week after she had last been seen, the police found her backpack along the footpath by the River Brent. In it had her belongings, including the shoes she had been wearing. Although there was still no sign of Alice or her phone, this was a massive lead as they now had an area to work on. The police chose to release the CCTV footage they had previously found to the public. It showed the backpack and shoes clearly, and they appealed for witnesses that may have seen the bag to urgently come forward. As Alice had depression, the police also had to consider the possibility of suicide. With 600 officers from 8 different forces, this had now become the largest deployment of Metropolitan Police officers in a search since the London bombings in 2005. They were reviewing hundreds of CCTV cameras, and a reward of £20,000 was being offered for anyone with information that could help find her. Using divers and sniffer dogs, the police began a mass search operation covering 9 square miles of woodland area, almost 4 miles of water. This was a massive and painstaking task, but with still no sightings or signs of Alice, they had no other options. They searched the murky waters and went through the thick woodlands with a fine-tooth comb, but the search turned up nothing. The phone data analysis revealed that when she sent the message to her father saying she was heading home, she was right by the River Brent. Detective Superintendent Mehta ordered another search of the area, believing there was more to find there. As the days continued to pass, the possibility of suicide was becoming less and less likely. Forensic scientists recognized that when a body first goes into the water, it will sink. As the body begins to decompose, bacteria will form which creates gases in the body, forcing the body to rise back up to the surface. If she had taken her own life through drowning, she would have been discovered by now. So if she was in the water, it was possible she was being held down by something. They ran a search on the missing persons database for the area, and were interested to find that a 41-year-old Arnis Sulkans, originally from Latvia, had also been reported missing. He had been living in Ealing for around 7 years working as a builder, and when he failed to return home from work, his partner contacted the police. Continuing to review the CCTV footage, they saw a middle-aged man on a bike, pedaling behind Alice over the bridge, just a few minutes behind her. He surely would have passed her at some point. He was spotted again on another camera, crossing a busy road and cycling down. Initially, there was nothing untoward. Except when the police looked deeper, they realized that the time it had taken for him to cycle from the bridge to the main road had taken almost 45 minutes, when normally it would take just a few. The man on the bike was formally identified as Arnis Sulkans. The cameras they had used to track down Alice began to paint a very sinister picture. The police saw Sulkans on CCTV riding back to the area where Alice had last been seen, twice in 12 hours. He returned at 7:45 and re-emerged from the area at 8:50 on the evening of the 28th. He was now wearing different clothes. He returned one final time just before 7 a.m. on the 29th. Further CCTV showed him in a shop, buying some beers at around 8 p.m. on the 28th. Mehta and his team headed for Sulkans' property in Ealing to begin the search. Upon doing a background check, the team's worst fears were realized. Sulkans had in fact been previously convicted of murder. He had beaten and stabbed his wife to death and buried her in a shallow grave. He served 7 years in a Latvian prison for the murder of his wife. In 2009, just 2 years after arriving in London, he sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl near the same canal he rode his bike down, just 2 miles from where Alice had gone missing. At the time, it wasn't Scotland Yard's policy to run the same checks that they do today, so Sulkans' past in Latvia was never brought to their attention. The 14-year-old girl did not make a formal statement, and he was never prosecuted. For weeks after the search for Alice began, the police did a reconstruction of the last route she took, with an actress wearing an identical outfit in the hope more people would remember seeing her. No piece of evidence was too small, and the police needed every lead they could get. Detective Mehta and his team knew they were now looking for a man behind Alice's disappearance and likely murder, but Sulkans was nowhere to be found, and the police were panicking that he may have left the country. September 30th, 5 weeks after Alice had last been seen, a devastating and gruesome discovery was made. Just a day later, they officially confirmed they had recovered the body of Alice Gross. She was naked apart from a single sock, tied up in a fetal position and wrapped in bin bags. She had been weighed down by bricks and logs and tied to a bicycle wheel. Further analysis showed that she had died of asphyxiation. A cigarette butt was found at the crime scene, which had Sulkans' DNA on it. DNA of his was also found on Alice's shoes inside her backpack. During their search of his property, underneath his patio, they discovered the back of Alice's iPhone 4S. For days after Alice's body was discovered, the police finally found Arnis Sulkans. He had committed suicide by hanging himself in a secluded, woody area of Boston Manor Park in Hounslow. The police speculate he had seen Alice while riding his bike and attempted to, or had managed, to sexually assault her and crush her to death. He then returned several times to try and conceal her body. It was a truly harrowing picture. The police confirmed that if they had found him alive, they would have enough to charge him with the murder of Alice Gross. On the 23rd of October, 2014, Alice was laid to rest, and her family and the community could finally begin to grieve. Her family fought tirelessly for the policies and procedures regarding background checks to be reviewed. Procedures for running background checks on people entering the UK have now been changed. The number of staff employed by the Criminal Records Office has grown, and requests for criminal records increased so that 80% of foreign suspects are now being thoroughly checked. Alice Gross was a talented, vibrant, and creative young girl. Her life was cut terribly short, but her amazing energy and passion for life will always be remembered. 23-year-old Molly McLaren from Kent in the UK was a warm, bubbly, and popular young woman. One of her friends said if she became your friend, you were friends for life. Molly was in her second year at Kent University and studying health and fitness, which was her main passion in life. Having battled bulimia, she was determined to overcome her issues and take back control. She even launched a blog talking about her recovery and offering support to others going through the same thing. Her mother said that although outwardly she was confident and positive, inside she was still quite reserved and could often feel insecure. But this didn't stop her from throwing herself into her studies, and she was on course to get a first-class honors degree. In the summer of 2016, Molly joined the dating app Tinder, and it was on this site that she 5-year-old Josh Stimson. They spoke for around 3 months before meeting up in person and quickly began a relationship. Stimson was open about his battles with bipolar disorder and even ran a marathon to raise money and awareness for it. Molly saw him as someone she could help and hoped he would be there for her too. Although initially the relationship seemed to be going well, Molly's friends and family soon started to see a change in Molly and how happy she was. Josh had started becoming controlling, and he eventually started turning up at her house uninvited and developed a problem with her spending time with other people. He started taking video recordings of her and tried to stop her being alone with her friends. This was a sign for Molly that she needed to spend more time on her studies and focus on herself. She decided she needed to end the relationship. While on an evening out with friends and with Josh exhibiting more controlling and emotionally abusive signs, she decided to break up with him. Although she said she felt guilty for doing this publicly, she also felt safe around her friends and in a public place to do this and knew it was the right time. Josh took the news badly and began a tirade of abuse on social media towards Molly, and would tag her parents in posts. He accused her of taking drugs amongst many other things. He continued to send her obsessive and abusive messages, and Molly texted a friend saying she was afraid of him. Her mother Jo decided enough was enough and took it to the police. At this point, with no criminal record, the police could only advise Molly to avoid all contact with him and keep track of everything. They did contact Josh, however, and told him if his behavior persisted, they would be forced to arrest him. A few days later, Stimson joined Molly, had applied to work, and continued to bombard her with messages and calls. The police spoke to him for a second time. Around 5 p.m. on June 27th, he bought a knife from an Asda in Chatham. He then bought a pickaxe from a nearby home base 24 minutes later. Things then went very quiet until Molly posted on Snapchat saying she was out for a meal and drinks with some friends. She thought nothing of this as Stimson had been blocked on everything. While she was out, however, Stimson turned up and Molly felt so violated and uncomfortable that she left early. The next day at around 10 a.m. she headed for a morning workout at Pure Gym at the Dockside Retail Park in Chatham, but the atmosphere quickly changed. At 10:25 Stimson arrives outside the same gym. He momentarily turns around on the stairs but comes back up and starts working out next to her. She sends messages to her friends and mother saying, "He's just turned up. I feel like I'm looking over my shoulder all the time. Leave straight away and come home." She has a brief conversation with Stimson before he leaves, again pausing on the stairs for a moment before heading outside. Molly waits a few minutes to leave the gym herself. The events that transpire soon after are nothing short of horrific. Just after 11 a.m., Molly McLaren got into her car in the car park of the gym, where she was ambushed and attacked by Stimson, who had been waiting for her. She was stabbed 75 times in a frenzied and brutal attack. In full view of the public, a passerby tried to save Molly by attempting to drag Stimson out of the car, but he was so covered in blood that the member of the public couldn't hold on to him to pull him out. When the police arrived, Stimson said, "She's in the car. I've killed her." It turned out that Stimson had gotten someone to keep track of Molly on social media, and that's how he knew her whereabouts the whole time. Her friends and family would hear about it on the news. Her mother said the second she heard the story, although they didn't confirm the name, she knew instantly it was her daughter. On June 30th, 2017, Josh Stimson was charged with murder. He claimed diminished responsibility and said he couldn't remember anything about the attack. The trial was set for the 23rd of January 2018, and on the 6th of February he was found guilty of the murder of Molly McLaren and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 26 years. Her parents accepted her university degree posthumously and went on to set up the Molly McLaren Foundation. It aims to raise awareness of eating disorders and help with funding for charities who provide support to people suffering from it, a fitting tribute to Molly McLaren. Police believe that Israel Key's violent crime spree began around 1996 and only ended when he was caught in 2012. Born in Utah in 1978 into a large Mormon family, Keyes was one of 10 children. He was homeschooled and would eventually consider himself a fundamentalist Christian. Between the ages of 3 and 5, his family moved from Utah to Colville and lived in a one-bedroom cabin with no water or electricity. It was here his family met and became friends with a white supremacist and later convicted murderer called Chevy O'Brien Kehoe. In 1998, Keyes joined the U.S. Army and served until he was discharged in 2001. He was said to have been quiet, although he would often drink heavily, consuming whole bottles of bourbon to himself. While he lived in Washington, Keyes admitted to murdering 4 people and killing another person in New York. He said once he started, there was nothing else like it. He also admitted to many bank robberies across Texas and New York and set someone's home on fire after robbing it. He said he killed a woman in New Jersey and also broke into a couple's home, sexually assaulting the woman and killing both of them. His final victim was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig. She worked at a coffee hut called Common Grounds in Anchorage, Alaska. On the 1st of February 2012, Israel Keyes entered the hut and ordered an Americano. When Samantha turned back around, he had a ski mask on and was pointing a gun at her. He orders her to turn off the lights and then gags her and forces her out of the coffee shop and into his car. He took her back to his house where he kept her in the shed for the rest of the day and subjected her to a horrific sexual assault and then killed her. He left her body in the shed for 2 weeks while he went on a family cruise. After the cruise was over, he committed more burglaries across Texas before returning to which would lead the police straight to him. He took Samantha's body, applied makeup to her face, and sewed her eyelids open with fishing wire before taking photographs of her holding a newspaper asking for $30,000 in ransom. After this, he dismembered her and dumped her body in Matanuska Lake. In March, he flew to Las Vegas and hired a car to drive to Arizona. He used the disguise as he withdrew $400 from Samantha's account using her card. The security camera picked up the rental car. Just 2 days later, her debit card showed it was being used again in Texas. The police were already looking for the same car that had been spotted. On March 13th, a police officer spotted the car wanted in connection with Samantha's disappearance outside a motel. When Keyes left the motel, the officer followed him. In his car, he had Samantha's debit card, the disguises he had used at the ATM machines, and a roll of money he had stolen from a bank. He was subsequently arrested and flown back to Alaska. It would be a while before Keyes admitted to anything. When he finally agreed to talk, he said he would only tell them the details if they promised to not let anything slip to the press. He said he didn't want his daughter to read about it in the papers. 2 months after she had last been seen, the police finally recovered Samantha's body. He eventually confessed to multiple horrific crimes while awaiting trial and said he chose the victims completely at random. The police believe there could be up to 11 victims and possibly even more. On May 23rd, he appeared before a judge at a hearing to set a trial date. He broke free from his steel leg shackles and jumped into the first row of seats. Officers had to taser him. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes committed suicide by cutting his wrists and strangling himself. He left a suicide note that read, "Ode to Murder," under his bed. He had drawn 11 skulls and blood. It is likely we will never know the full extent and story surrounding the victims of Israel Keyes, but investigators continue to follow up on leads and use Keyes' own confession to try and piece together as much as they can. Michelle Lee was a 26-year-old nursing student from San Diego, California. Studying at Samuel Merritt University, she was working at the Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in the San Francisco Bay Area. She worked on the maternity ward, which she loved. Michelle was close to getting her degree in nursing and was excited for the future that lay ahead. Alongside nursing, she was also a part-time accountant and worked hard to balance everything. Her mother had also been a nurse but had tragically died of cancer in 1999 when Michelle was just 15. She took on the maternal role in her family, looking after her younger brother and cousin. She never struggled to make friends and was a very popular young woman. Kind, caring, smart, and hardworking, nursing was the perfect fit for her. May 27, 2011, on a quiet Friday evening. Michelle was in the middle of a clinical training session. This was the final class she needed to complete in order to graduate. And finishing this would complete her internship. She told the supervisor she quickly needed to head to her car to get some medication. Michelle never returned and the instructor was deeply concerned. She headed out to the parking lot with a security guard to try and find her. She saw Michelle's white Honda drive away, and although the instructor called out after her, the car never came back. People at the hospital tried to contact her, but they only received text messages back, one of which said she was heading to Reno and wanted to be left alone. With only a day left of her internship and with graduation just a short while away, this made no sense to her classmates. Her purse, wallet, and driver's license were all still in the break room. The hospital security guard found blood on the floor of the parking lot where Michelle's car had been parked, and it became apparent that something deeply sinister had happened. Fortunately, the police quickly located her car the following morning thanks to a theft and recovery tracker, and it was parked half a mile away in a parking lot of an apartment complex. Inside the car was a lot of blood, and it was clear that Michelle didn't leave the hospital of her own accord. Police found a hospital ID badge in the car, but it wasn't Michelle's. It belonged to someone called Katie Miller. Katie had only just enrolled and was yet to start at the hospital. She was in Hawaii at the time of Michelle's disappearance. So who had stolen Katie's ID and how had they done it? Her family and friends were baffled, and no one had any idea as to who would want to hurt Michelle. Michelle's best friend Giselle Esteban came forward and told police that she had seen Michelle that night at the hospital along the walkway. Giselle had gone through school with Michelle and had been hoping to study nursing alongside her pregnant and had a baby with her boyfriend Scott. Unable to balance it all, Giselle dropped out of school and her and Michelle eventually started to drift apart. Giselle was at the hospital that night getting a scan as she revealed to police she was pregnant for a second time. She told the police that Scott and Michelle had been an item and the investigators needed to look more closely at him. There was a lot of CCTV around the hospital, and if Scott was involved, the police felt certain he would have been picked up on camera somewhere. While they were checking the cameras, Scott was interviewed about what he said was a platonic and friendly relationship with Michelle. He appeared very open, honest, and forthcoming. The cameras from the parking lot had hundreds of hours of footage across several cameras. At 6:55, the cameras picked up Michelle crossing the walkway just as Esteban had said. Nothing appeared wrong or out of place, but the only camera pointing at her car wasn't connected properly and showed nothing. They finally see her car, but the driver cannot be made out. Inside the building and tracking where Katie's keycard had been scanned, they spot something. A woman is seen around the hospital in various locations wearing a baseball cap covering her face. She is seen trying and failing to get into several rooms. She manages to get into one with Katie's keycard. She turns off the lights, grabs a lab coat, and picks up some files. In this moment, they realize who it was. It was Giselle Esteban, Michelle's best friend. Giselle was brought in by police for formal questioning. She was standoffish with investigators and covered her face the whole time. The shoes that she had worn that day tested positive for Michelle's blood, and Giselle's hair was also found in Michelle's car. Her ex-boyfriend Scott told police that Giselle had threatened him and Michelle's life for talking to each other. Even without Michelle's body, the police had enough to charge Giselle Esteban with murder. They believed that Giselle had become so obsessed with the idea of Scott and Michelle being together, it totally consumed and enraged her. She arrived at the hospital that morning claiming she was interested in joining the nursing course. And after being let in by someone, she waited for the secretary to leave before she stole Katie's keycard and the roster telling her where Michelle would be working. She returned that evening and waited for Michelle to head in on her own. She had attacked and killed her in the car park before driving away to dump the car and Michelle's body. September 10, 2011. 10 days after Giselle was arrested, the police find the skeletal remains of Michelle Lee. Around the body were her white scrubs that she had been wearing the night she vanished. Giselle was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years. Scott, who already had 80% custody of their daughter, continued looking after her, and the baby she birthed in prison was given to her parents. Michelle Lee had an enormous impact on everyone she came into contact with. Her friends, family, and colleagues are determined that her memory will live on. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Paige Doherty was born on April 17, 2000 and lived in Clydebank, Scotland. She had a great relationship with her family and lived with her mom Pamela, stepfather Andy, and her 3 siblings. She was especially close to her mother, and Pamela said Paige was her best friend. Although only 4'8", she was a feisty teenager. She was a talented dancer, and her teachers described her as having a great, sharp sense of humor. She hoped one day to have her own beauty salon. Friday the 18th of March 2016, Paige left home for a sleepover at her friend's house. The following morning, she headed to her part-time job at a hair salon around 12 miles away in Kirkintilloch. This job was an exciting step for her. She loved anything hair, makeup, and fashion and was always enjoying changing and playing with her looks. She always caught the same bus from East Barn Street, and as she started early, she would normally make a stop on the way to grab some breakfast. At around midday, her boyfriend Dylan became concerned as he hadn't heard from Paige all morning. Paige was always near or on her phone and social media, and she never ignored messages for a long period of time. Dylan knew this was out of character, but wondering if her phone had maybe run out of battery. He phoned the salon just to check and see if she'd made it to work. But although her boss was expecting her in, no one at the salon had seen or heard from her. Paige was very respectful and mature. She loved her job and never missed a day of work. When Dylan phoned Paige's mom Pamela, she said that she too hadn't heard from her. And alarm bells were starting to ring for everyone. The police were notified and arrived at Paige's house to gain some more understanding about the last day she had been seen. They understood that for Paige to not be on her social media or mobile phone and to not contact her mom, boyfriend, or place of work was very troubling. The police began to search the areas surrounding her home and her friend's house, but as the hours ticked by, there was still no sign of Paige. It was becoming obvious that this wasn't simply a girl that had forgotten to charge her phone and lost track of time. This was now a serious missing persons case. Her family were beside themselves with worry and wanting to get the word out as quickly as possible. They set up a Facebook page called Help Find Paige. Pamela posted pictures of her clothes and her last known locations and bus routes. Using these routes, the police started looking at the houses and businesses along her bus route to work. A shopkeeper named Ashley Armid said he had seen Paige walking past his store and waved at him as she went past. This was around 8:15 a.m. The police now knew she had definitely left her friend's house with the intention of going to work that day. Ashley told the police although she had popped in on the Saturday before to pick up a breakfast roll, the Saturday she was clearly headed to the deli next door. Delicious Deli was owned by a man called John Leatham. Later on, Ashley said he spoke to Leatham and asked how Paige had seen that day, and nothing seemed amiss. Ashley's shop had been there for around 20 years and he'd known Paige all her life. He was desperate to help more, so he offered his CCTV footage to the police, which would hopefully, at the very least, show the direction she had left the deli on. Ashley had only the CCTV of the strip of shops, but the police knew this showed the whole area clearly, so they would have a lot to go off. The CCTV would take some time to process, but at this point it was the only lead the police had. On Monday afternoon at around 12:45 p.m., just 2 days after she had last been seen, the news everyone was dreading came in. Paige's body had been found at the side of Great Western Road in some woodland. Her mother would talk of her gut instinct and how she knew on the Saturday night that something bad had happened and was preparing herself for the worst. Paige's official cause of death was listed as sharp force injuries to the neck, and she had around 61 stab wounds with over 100 injuries to her body, inflicted with at least 3 weapons. It was a truly brutal attack. No one had any idea who would ever want to hurt Paige in this way. Her mother was targeted by online trolls, sending her pictures of her daughter alongside gruesome and horrendous comments. Although twisted, none of these people were considered suspects, and the police decided to head back out onto the strip of shops where Paige had last been seen. They were still waiting for the CCTV footage to come through, but wanted more information from the shopkeepers. Despite what Ashley Armid had said about his conversation with 31-year-old John Leatham, Leatham said he couldn't keep track of all his customers and told the police he didn't recognize Paige. Although this was possible, it was a small community and Paige was a regular, so the police knew it was highly unlikely that he didn't know who she was. They probed deeper, and Leatham eventually said he did remember seeing her. He said she came in to buy a breakfast roll, they chatted for a while, and then she left to go and catch her bus. Due to where her body had been found, the police were almost certain that she had never made it onto the bus. When the CCTV footage finally came in, the police could clearly see her entering the deli, just as Ashley had said at around 8:21 a.m. They watched and waited for her to leave, but she never re-emerged from the deli. The police had only a couple of hours of tape, and it was possible she had stayed in the deli for a longer period of time, but John Leatham said she had came and went. And with her job expecting her shortly after, it made no sense as to why she would be there for so long. The police asked Leatham to come in for questioning, as they needed to know why he had lied about how long she had stayed in Delicious Deli for. They also asked him for any CCTV of inside the shop and requested further footage from Ashley's shop front too. Lethem turned over what he said was all the footage, but it was immediately evident that it wasn't all of it by any means. Large portions of the video were missing, and it didn't even show Paige entering the deli at all. It was starting to become apparent that something frightening had happened to Paige inside that building. Lethem is seen opening up at around 7:17 a.m. and bringing in some takeout coffee cups. Ashley's CCTV footage shows Paige entering at 8:21 a.m., but just 10 minutes later the shutters went back down on the deli. At 9:27 he left the deli and returned within a few minutes with his car parked outside. The shop then opens for service at 9:36. At 9:58 he is seen running from around the back of his shop to another store next door, then just a minute later he runs out again and round the back. For minutes later he heads to his car and moves some things around in the boots. The boot remains open as he heads back inside. He was then shown returning carrying a large bin bag. Just before noon he exits the building a final time, gets in his car and drives off. Luther returns at around 6:04 and he is now wearing different clothes. The owner of the neighboring shop said that when John was seen there at 9:58 a.m. he was buying cleaning products and bin bags. A local hairdresser that had caught John just before 9:30 when he was heading to his car said he had told her he had a nosebleed and was needing to collect his car. On the March 21st, 2 days after Paige had last been seen, he was also caught on CCTV in a wooded area close to Great Western Road, less than a mile from the deli and close to where Paige's body had been found. The evidence was overwhelming, and on the March 23, 2016, 4 days after Paige Doherty had gone missing, Delicious Deli was officially a crime scene and Lethem was in custody. Lethem answered no comments, but said they wouldn't find any of her blood anywhere in the deli. Forensic investigators, however, would prove him wrong. An examination of the building found Paige's DNA on the walls and between the floorboards. The police believed that when he had left the deli at around noon, he drove just 500 yards to his house where he concealed Paige in his garden shed. He took his wife and child out for a meal the day after and went about his day as normal. A day later, he moved Paige's body to the side of the road. On the 24th of March, the town's iconic Titan crane was lit up pink throughout the night to honor Paige Doherty. This awful crime had shattered the community and the whole town was mourning the loss of such a beloved young girl. The case had moved rapidly. John Lethem was charged with murder and appeared at Hamilton Sheriff Court on March 26th and again on April 1st, but both times he made no plea. On the 26th of April, 2016, Paige Doherty was laid to rest and the pain the community felt was evident, as well as the anger that something like this could even happen. She would have turned 16 just a few days later. 2 fundraising campaigns helped Paige's family meet the funeral costs and made more than £14,000 a day after they were set up. 7 months after Paige had last been seen, on the 12th of October, John Lethem pled guilty in the High Court at Glasgow to the murder of Paige Doherty. Lethem claimed that on the morning of March 19th, Paige had inquired about a job at the deli, but upon finding out she was only 15, he said it might not work out. He then claimed that Paige had said if he didn't give her the job, she would tell everyone he had touched her inappropriately. He felt the only way to get out of the situation was to stop her. Paige's family were horrified and said Paige would never have done something like that. Judge Ray said, "You claim she threatened to reveal you had touched her inappropriately if you didn't give her that job. No evidence has been placed before me to support this. Even if true, your reaction was in no way mitigating of this appalling, wicked crime. There is no evidence or motive to explain the ferocity of this attack." Not long after he began his sentence, he managed to successfully appeal it in February 2017, and his sentence was reduced to 23 years. On the second anniversary of her death, Weston Bartonshire Council paid tribute to Paige and every other victim of violence by lighting up the Titan crane in red. Paige's mother Pamela joined forces with Kevin Woodburn. Kevin's son Sean was murdered in 2017, and he knew the pain that Pamela had gone through all too well. They requested that unless an extension is agreed to, a 14-day limit must be put on postmortems to save the families of victims more pain and stop them from laying their loved ones to rest. The bill was then given to the Justice Committee. It then started to go through a 3-stage parliamentary process, and if it's approved at each stage, it will become law. As of May 2020, it is at its first stage. The charity Paige's Promise was set up to help support grieving families with retreats and offer self-defense classes to children. Paige Doherty was a talented, passionate, and clever young girl. She showed tremendous promise and had big dreams. Although her life was cut dreadfully short, her bright, bubbly personality is still remembered fondly throughout the community she lived in. Sian Emma O'Callaghan was born on the 3rd of June, 1988 in Swindon, Wiltshire. She was described as a bubbly, friendly, and happy girl who adored her family and doted on her siblings. After leaving school at 16, she briefly attended her local college but quickly determined it wasn't the right path for her and went on to get a job as an office administrator, which she loved. 18th of March 2011, Sian heads into town for a night out with some girlfriends. It's the start of the weekend and end of the working week for Sian, and she is out to let her hair down and enjoy some drinks and dancing with friends. After some food and a few trips to local pubs, the last stop of the evening is the Suju nightclub in Wiltshire, just half a mile from the flat she shared with her partner of a couple of years, Kevin. Early morning, Sunday, March 19th, Sian's mother Elaine is on a hotel mini-break with her partner when she receives a concerning phone call from her son Liam. Kevin has contacted him to see if he has heard from or seen Sian, as she hasn't come home. She's not answering her phone and she's not being present on social media. Although concerned, Elaine remains calm and decides to give it more time. She leaves several voicemails throughout the morning but receives no answer back from Sian. Just before 10 a.m., her partner Kevin raises the alarm with Wiltshire police. He is frantic with worry and desperate for answers. This behavior is totally out of character, and no one can make sense of it. She is officially reported as a missing person, and the investigation begins with Detective Superintendent Stephen Fulcher and his team in charge of the case. They begin with the people closest to her, her family, and Kevin. Kevin tells the police that he returned home from some drinks with friends at around midnight. He called Sian to check on her and she didn't pick up. Thinking nothing of it, he sent her a text message and then another at around 3:30 a.m. Phone records would corroborate this, and would also confirm that Sian's phone was no longer ringing at all. Some of the friends that she was at Suju nightclub with helped fill in the gaps. They said they had lost Sian at around 2:30 a.m. and after looking for her left shortly after, assuming she had simply gone home. After confirming what Sian was wearing that night, the police headed to Suju to gather any camera footage they could. It doesn't take long for them to pick her up on the club's CCTV. Just before 3 a.m. they follow Sian as she is seen leaving the club and going down the street that would have been consistent with her route home. While the police were continuing to check the CCTV, missing persons flyers were being handed out and the general public was helping in the search for Sian. Media outlets began to run the story, hoping to generate more witnesses and publicity for the case. Her family and partner made an emotional public appeal for answers, witnesses, and support. An anonymous donor offered a reward of £20,000 as the search intensifies. Digging deeper into the footage along Sian's walk home, the cameras pick her up again. She's alone and walking down a deserted road. A few cars drive past her, and although she momentarily disappears from view, she is still just visible at the end of the street as the cars pass. At 2:37 a.m. another car pulls into view, but this one does not drive past her. The flashing of headlights indicates that the car's hazard lights are on. The car pulled over right to where Sian would have been at the time. After a few minutes, the car eventually pulls off and Sean is no longer in sight, not on this camera, but not on any of the others further down the road. It becomes clear to the police that Sean is in that car. The same vehicle is picked up on other cameras a couple of hours before Sean had last been seen. It is a dark-colored Toyota with taxi markings and appears to be circling around the same area. The police launch an appeal to find the car and its owner. The reward for Sian is now sitting at £40,000, and the community are continuing to throw themselves into the case in any way they can. Thanks to a police car that had been driving around the same area at the same time, miraculously, the number plate of this mystery car had been scanned. It confirms a dark green Toyota Aventus, and it is registered to a taxi driver, 47-year-old Christopher Hallowell. Although he has no criminal past, the police were deeply concerned. He hadn't spoken to them and told them that he was the one that evidently picked her up. Meanwhile, Vulture and his team are analyzing Sian's phone records and are trying to find the current location of her LGE 900 Optimus phone. The last cell phone tower ping puts the phone at the location of Svernak Forest. This is extremely concerning to the police as it is close to 15 miles away from her last known location, yet the phone records put her there just 32 minutes after she left the club. There is no way she could have walked there. and there is no logical reason that Sion would have been there at 3:30 a.m. It is around this point that Fulcher requests the public to take a step back with their self-led searches as the case is progressing very quickly and he believes they are close to finding Sion. One of the police's final moves is to head to Hollowell's taxi firm to check the GPS data that is stored for all vehicles. This tracks where the taxis were and at what time, and this evidence would prove vital. On March 19th, Hollowell switched off his GPS at around 2:30 after clocking off for the night, yet CCTV proves he remained in town, circling the streets, and just 2 days later his GPS tracker shows him driving to where Sion lives. This information was not yet public knowledge and added more evidence to the already strong case against him. March 22nd, cameras pick up Hollowell at a petrol station very late one evening. Upon paying for his petrol and sweets, his demeanor quickly changes and he's visibly on edge. On the counter, a picture of Sion can be seen in the form of a missing persons poster. Hollowell turns his head away and covers her face on the poster with a packet of sweets. He then rushes out of the station and drives away. On day 6 of Hollowell's surveillance, the police follow him to an Asda supermarket where he buys what would have been a lethal dose of over-the-counter painkillers. The team know that they have to make their move now before it is too late. He is arrested in the car park of the supermarket. Detective Fulcher instructs his officers to drive Hollowell to Barbary Castle rather than to a police station. He wants to continue the immediate questioning in a non-threatening environment and believes that Ashen is still alive. This is the only chance they have of rescuing her. Over the next few hours, Fulcher perseveres, knowing that this is the man that abducted Sion, but he wants to hear it from Hollowell himself. Fulcher's hard work eventually pays off. Hollowell cracks and says he will take them to Sion. She is recovered almost 100 feet down a hill with stab wounds to the back of her skull and neck. It is confirmed she likely died from these injuries. It's unclear whether she was coaxed into the taxi that night into false pretenses of a safe lift home or whether she was forced in somehow. But the police speculate she could have fallen asleep in the car and only woken up when Hollowell had already driven her out to the forest. A fight ensued after Sion realized she was in danger and Hollowell stabbed her to death. As the police were stood by Sean's body, Hollowell utters the following words. "Do you want another one?" 20-year-old sex worker Becky God went missing back in 2003. Hollowell had reportedly become fascinated with God after meeting her on his taxi routes in Swindon's red light district. In January 2003, after having sex with her, he strangled her and buried her body in a field in Gloucestershire. Although it was closure on 2 cases that had brought so much trauma to so many people, this line of questioning would see Stephen Fulcher found guilty of gross misconduct. And it meant that any evidence in the Godden case was deemed inadmissible in court and required a separate and lengthy investigation to find further information to tie Hollowell to her. Fulcher would eventually resign from the police service in 2014. He maintains to this day that it was the right and best thing to do for the case and the families and says he doesn't regret his decisions. In September 2011, Christopher Hollowell was found guilty of the kidnap and murder of Shane O'Callaghan, being handed a life sentence. And in March 2016, he was also found guilty of taking Becky Godden's life too. He is said to have laughed as the guilty verdict was read out, showing no sign of remorse, and grinned as he was led back to his cell. He is now serving the most severe sentence possible in British criminal law, a whole life order, meaning he will never be released and he will die behind bars. On the April 18, 2011, over 500 people filled the streets of Swindon for Sion's funeral, although it was a private ceremony. The funeral procession slowly drove through the town, giving the public the chance to pay their respects to her and grieve. Sion's vibrant, warm, and sociable personality was evident in how many people had turned out to pay their respects and honor her memory. Despite the tragic circumstances surrounding the deaths of Becky Godden and Shane O'Callaghan, their friends and family are determined that their memories will never be forgotten. The city of Pocatello is located in the northwestern state of Idaho. It's largely made up by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and is considered a safe, close, and tight-knit community. Known as the Gateway to the Northwest, for over 100 years Pocatello has been home to tourists, travelers, and residents alike. It is a place that people are proud to call their home. However, in 2006, the city of Pocatello would be at the center of one of the most horrific and disturbing murders in modern U.S. history. Just 4 days before Christmas in 1989, Cassie Jo Stoddart was born. She grew up in a secure and loving family who fought the world of her. She was a committed and straight-A student who kept out of trouble, had lots of friends, and was on the right path in life. As she was both reliable and trustworthy, her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, asked her to house it for them and watch their pets whilst they were out of town. So on the evening of the 22nd of September 2006, she headed over to the house. Whilst at the home on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bannock County, she invited over her boyfriend, Matt Beckham, at around 6 p.m. Later in the evening, her school friends, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk, who she went with, also visited. She gave them a tour of the house and then they settled in to watch a film. The teens were halfway through Kill Bill Volume 2 when Brian and Tori said they were going to go to a cinema to watch a film instead, and with that they left. While Cassie and Matt continued relaxing, without warning, the power went out. Unsure as to what to do, Cassie became uneasy, but before long the power came back on. Matt spotted one of the dogs staring down the basement stairs before it started to bark and growl, but he thought nothing more of it. Matt rang his mother to see if he could stay with Cassie that night as she felt unsafe. His mother said no, but said that Cassie was welcome to stay with them. She declined, saying that she had been asked to look after the house by her family and felt obliged to stay. At around 10:30 p.m., Matt's mother arrived to collect him. Brian and Tori wanted to meet up, so called them. As they said they were going to the cinema, Tori was whispering so Matt couldn't hear what he was saying. Matt ultimately decided to stay at home. 2 days later, on Sunday, Cassie's family returned home to Whispering Cliffs Drive. Upon entering the house, Cassie's 13-year-old cousin was confronted by a horrific and traumatizing sight. Cassie was found on the living room floor, having been stabbed to death in a frenzied and brutal attack. The police quickly arrived on scene and sealed off the area. An autopsy revealed that Cassie had been stabbed approximately 30 times, with 12 of the wounds being potentially fatal. 3 days after Cassie's body was found, the police announced they had made arrests in connection with her murder, and this would send shockwaves throughout this tight-knit community. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had been taken into custody and were being interrogated by investigators. People were stunned. These were not only classmates, but trusted friends who Cassie enjoyed spending time with. Both boys were considered social outsiders, but Cassie had embraced and befriended them. Brian had spent most of his childhood in Utah before his family moved to Pocatello. It was at Pocatello High School that he met Tori Adamczyk, and they soon bonded over their mutual love of film. They used a camera to document different aspects of their lives, and Cassie soon featured in many of their recordings. On September 27th, after hours of interrogation, Brian Draper agreed to lead officers to where he and Tori Adamczyk had gotten rid of the items they had used in Cassie's murder. A partially burned mask, a Sony videotape, and a partially burned handwritten note. Police tried to decipher what the note said and were able to determine a few sentences, parts of which read, "Is home alone? Stop out the house." Runs into Tori. "We murder Cassie." Brian chases her. "Kill her." The terrifying picture was starting to become clear. This had not been a spur-of-the-moment murder. This had been a carefully planned and executed crime, a fantasy that they had been determined to carry out. As the investigation continued, they uncovered more disturbing evidence against Brian and Tori. The pair had filmed Cassie on the morning of the murder when they were at school. Investigators also found footage of them gleefully talking about what it was they were about to do. There should be no odds against killing people. I know it's a wrong thing, but that night had finally become clear. Whilst at the house and giving them the tour, Cassie had shown them the basement, and before they left, Brian unlocked the door to ensure that he and Tori could re-enter the house without them being noticed. After they said they were going to head to the cinema, they left the house and returned to the neighborhood later and parked down the street. I'm at 9:50, September 22nd, 2006. We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I locked the back doors, that's all locked. Now we've just got to wait. They left the car and put on dark clothes, gloves, and masks before heading back to the home. They let themselves in through the unlocked basement door and cut the power at the circuit breaker, plunging the house into total darkness. They hoped that Cassie and Matt would come down to the basement to investigate, but when neither of them did, they turned the power back on. The dog that was growling and staring down the stairs had spotted the pair of them hiding in the basement. When Matt rang to ask if they wanted to hang out, Tori was whispering so he wouldn't be discovered hiding inside the house. After they were sure that Matt had gone, the pair cut the power again. Brian opened and slammed a door at the top of the stairs. The aim was to scare Cassie as much as possible. They then terrorized and terrified her before brutally stabbing her to death. The disturbing details did not stop there. Tori Adamczyk and Brian Draper, two seemingly unremarkable 16-year-old boys, were charged with first-degree murder. During the interviews, the boys turned on each other. Brian initially said that while he had been in the room when Cassie was murdered, it was Tori who had stabbed her and not him. He later confessed to stabbing her, but said that it was under Tori's orders. As the pair went on trial, the small city of Pocatello became the center of a national media firestorm. Journalists from all over the country had gathered to follow this disturbing case to its conclusion. The damning video footage was shown to the court. Stunned onlookers watched on in silence, and they saw how Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had meticulously planned their crime and the glee they had taken in murdering their classmate and friend. One question that people wanted answered was why. Brian revealed that he had been inspired by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who became internationally notorious when they carried out the Columbine High School massacre in 1999. Tori Adamczyk was said to be influenced by the classic horror film Scream. The first film focuses on a group of high school students who are terrorized and hunted by a masked killer. Part of the killer's modus operandi is they scare and terrorize their victims before brutally stabbing them. On the April 17, 2007, Brian Draper was found guilty, and less than 2 months later, so was Tori Adamczyk. They were convicted of first-degree murder and received the mandatory life sentence of life without the possibility of parole. They also received 30 years to life for conspiracy to commit murder. The life sentences given to the pair could be reviewed, as the case of Miller versus Alabama declared that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders was unconstitutional. Since their sentence, the pair have filed several appeals against their convictions, however none so far have been successful. They are currently both serving their sentences in the Idaho State Correctional Institution. In the years following the murder, Brian and Tori have appeared in several documentaries about their crime. Tori Adamczyk was also interviewed as part of an episode of the true crime show Cold Justice. He was suspected of stabbing a woman to death in her own home in Pocatello just 2 years before the murder of Cassie. Although DNA evidence would eventually rule Tori out, the police were able to gain further insight into him while they were investigating. They conducted a telephone interview with Brian Draper, who revealed some disturbing details about Tori's personality. Tori's mother Shannon has also written a book about her son's case called The Guilty Innocent. The book takes the reader behind the scenes of the trial. She argues that the prosecutors did not care for the truth, but more about public opinion, and that the defense team her son had, who had never argued a murder case before, lacked the experience her son needed to fight his corner. In 2010, Cassie's family launched a civil claim against the District of Idaho. They argued that Brian and Tori had long posed a threat and danger to others, and that the school had been negligent in failing to notice. The civil court dismissed their claim alongside the state Supreme Court, saying that the actions of the pair were not foreseeable. The devastation caused by the murder of Cassie Jo Studdart is both irreparable and immeasurable. The day she was found in her aunt and uncle's house, the family left and never went back. The police helped tidy up the crime scene and provided temporary accommodation, but they could not bring themselves to re-enter the home. They have repeatedly tried to sell but have not been able to find a buyer. Her devastated family have fought tirelessly not only for justice, but to ensure that the bright, funny, and hard-working Cassie will never be forgotten. On the 21st of March, 1998, the Bradley family from Virginia embarked on what was to be the holiday of a lifetime. Parents Ron and Ivor, 21-year-old son Brad, and daughter Amy, who was just shy of her 24th birthday. They were a tight-knit family, but Amy and her brother Brad were especially close and more like best friends. Amy Lynn Bradley was a talented and sporty young woman. She was a former swimming instructor and athlete and had her pick of many scholarships after she graduated high school. She was a sports science major and was about to undertake a master's degree in sports psychology before Amy started her studies again. Ron Bradley had been given the tickets by his work, and although the family were excited for the all-expenses-paid holiday, Amy seemed less sure on going. Although she was a confident swimmer, she wasn't a fan of the ocean. She finally came round to the idea, though, and the family would be traveling on a luxury cruise liner called Rhapsody of the Seas. The ship was taking around 2,500 passengers from Puerto Rico to Aruba. A couple of days into the trip, on March 23rd, the family dined out. Code was black tie, and Amy was receiving a lot of attention from fellow passengers and crew members, including the ship's band. Amy and her brother Brad had some official photographs taken that would be available for the families to buy later on. They were seen wearing formal attire along the stairwell of the ship. While the photographs were being taken, Ivor said that a waiter had approached the table asking if he could talk to Amy, as some of the staff wanted to take her to a bar on the mainland before they set off again. Her mother described this as strange, and when Amy and Brad rejoined the table, Amy what he had said. Amy agreed with her mother and said she would definitely stay on the ship. After they finished their food, they headed upstairs to the nightclub. Some of the cruise ship staff that the family had seen at dinner were also in there, including the ship's band. At around 1 a.m., Ron and Ivor headed to bed, but Amy and Brad stayed with the people in the band. Amy's mother kissed her, told her she loved her and that she would see her in the morning. As 4 a.m. rolled round, a tired Brad headed back to the cabin to join his parents, and 15 minutes later, Amy did not too. They spoke on the balcony for a while and Brad headed to bed, leaving Amy there. When her father woke up just after 5 a.m., he said he saw Amy was still on the balcony and he went back to sleep, satisfied that both of his children were now safe in the cabin. But 30 minutes later, when Ron awoke again, he said that Amy was no longer on the balcony nor in her bed. All of her belongings were in the cabin, and it appeared the only thing missing were her cigarettes and lighter. Even her shoes were still there. What could have possibly happened in just 30 minutes? Ron assumed she must have headed to the main deck, but after searching for over an hour, it appeared she had vanished. Almost 2 hours after she had last been seen, the captain of the ship authorized a call out over the tannoy for Amy Bradley to head to the service desk. We went up and looked around. Disco and all the different floors, and you realize it wasn't just an everyday situation. Her parents feared that as the ship was docked, people might begin to try and leave, and this would further complicate the situation. Panic further began to mount in her family's minds when the captain said that regardless of any situation, passengers had to disembark the ship as scheduled. With the majority of people now leaving the ship, the captain and his crew began to search for the missing Amy. Her mother Ivor was convinced that her going missing was tied in with the attention she had been receiving the previous evening. As her brother was out looking for her, the bass player of the ship's band, Alastair Douglas, allegedly approached Brad, saying he was sorry to hear about her being missing. As there had been no announcements to confirm she was missing, and with only the captain and security team being aware of this, her brother was confused and concerned that he knew about it. This is a claim that Alastair Douglas would later refute. After almost 12 hours of searching, the crew concluded that Amy was not on the ship, and when her parents begged for an official announcement to be made that she was missing, the captain refused on the grounds it would disturb the other guests. The crew asked the family if she had maybe fallen into the water or committed suicide, but both of these theories were squashed by the Bradley family. Because Amy didn't like the ocean, she would have never gotten too close to the rails, so this seemed impossible to have done on her own accord. She was happy and excited for her future, and suicide just didn't seem viable. The ship had just 4 hours before it would set sail again, and the captain said they either had to disembark or stay on, despite the crew saying that Amy was not on the ship. It was a heartbreaking choice to have to make, but the family eventually chose to disembark in Carousel, and they watched the boat sail away to St. Thomas without them. Essentially stranded in a foreign land, the family contacted the FBI and begged for help. The FBI told them to fly to St. Thomas and get back on the ship at any cost and on their say-so. The FBI contacted the cruise liner, and upon probing for more information, they determined that a full and thorough search had not actually been carried out. Valuable time had now been lost, and what had started as a dream holiday had descended into a living nightmare for the Bradley family. It was now the 26th of March, and with the FBI on board the ship, it was finally being investigated as a missing persons case. The case would take a sinister turn. Had taken photos of Amy, and Brad realized that these photos had disappeared from the public gallery only a few hours after they had been put up. Only Amy and Brad's photographs were missing. 2 panicked witnesses came forward and said they had seen Amy coming out of a lift at around 5:45 a.m. heading back into the nightclub with Alastair Douglas. He was now the last known person to be seen with her. Off the back of this information, he was given a polygraph test, which he passed. The cruise ship had a videographer who would record the holiday as part of promotional material for the company. The same videographer would unknowingly film Amy on the same morning she disappeared, dancing in the nightclub with the bass player. And when he realized he had filmed her, he turned over all his footage to the security team on board with the intent of it going to the FBI. But for unknown reasons, this was not done, and it would be well over a year before the footage would come to light. As soon as the cruise ended, the Bradley family headed back to Carousel to continue their hunt for Amy. A local cab driver told the family that Amy had in fact approached his cab that morning as people had started to disembark the ship. She ran over and asked him where the nearest phone was. His description of Amy convinced the family it was definitely her that he had seen. He told them to look in 3 specific locations on the island, but the searches turned up nothing. They had been on the island for 4 days and were driving when Brad heard a familiar voice. He was convinced it was Amy calling out his name. When they caught up with the van he thought he heard the sound come from, there was only a driver inside. Brad would say he didn't know if they had followed the wrong van or simply heard what he'd wanted to hear. The exhausted family eventually had to leave and return home to Virginia. In August 1998, a Canadian tourist called David Carmichael, visiting Carousel, claimed he had come face to face with Amy Bradley. To say that one of the men fit the description of Alastair Douglas. The cab driver and Carmichael's accounts further cemented her family's initial fears that she had been kidnapped, forced off the ship, and was now being held captive on the island. Theories surrounding the sex slave industry and potential human trafficking would further arise. In the fall of 1999, the Bradley family finally saw a glimmer of hope. They were contacted by a private investigator called Frank Jones, who was a former U.S. Army Special Forces officer. He was keen to help the family and believed he had the means and the backing of his old Army Ranger colleagues to help save her. Jones had heard from an insider, a cook called Margarita, that Amy was being held captive in a housing complex surrounded by barbed wire and guards. She said she often saw Amy shopping and working out but was never alone and was always with a man with long blonde hair. She was able to give accurate details of Amy's many tattoos, and the Bradleys agreed that this lead could not be ignored. Between Ron, Ivor, friends, other family members, and even Ron's former company, a total of $210,000 was paid to Frank Jones over several years to help with what could be an immense and difficult rescue mission. He sent the family several pictures of a woman on a beach with a man with long blonde hair. She had Amy's build and the same tattoo on her ankle. Some hope that their beloved daughter was alive. This hope would come crashing down when the truth finally came out. Frank Jones was actually a cold-hearted, manipulative con man. He had never served in the army and had been spending their money on what was essentially a long holiday. The photos were posed for by models with a man wearing a blonde wig and a fake tattoo on the woman's ankle. Margarita was also a liar who had taken around $8,000 from the family. And trusted friend of the Bradleys, Tim Buchholz, began to keep a closer eye on Jones. He observed him for a long time and contacted the Bradleys to tell them the truth about the man they had trusted to help them. The family were devastated. In February 2002, Jones was charged with defrauding both the Bradleys and the nation's missing children's organization. He pleaded guilty to mail fraud and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was also told to repay every penny. Ron Bradley would later say, "If it was your child, what would you do? So I guess we took a chance and I guess we lost." Another lead was reported to the FBI, again from the island of Carousel. Back in 1999, an American naval officer was visiting a brothel. He claimed that a woman walked straight up to him, grabbed his arm, and said her name was Amy Bradley. She needed help and she was being held captive. The naval officer never reported this to anyone for fear of the repercussions that would come with admitting he had been in a brothel while on duty. When the FBI eventually got hold of this information, it turned out the brothel had since burned down and there was no evidence or further witnesses to be found there. Another massive lead came in 2005 when a photo was anonymously emailed to the family. It showed a woman called Jazz on an escort site based in the Caribbean. A forensic detective compared these photos to the photos of Amy from 7 years ago and determined it was absolutely her. He said he would even bet his career on it. This image was circulated using an appearance on the Dr. Phil show in November 2005. Again in 2005, a lady named Judy Mora claimed she had seen Amy in the public bathroom of a department store in Barbados. She was closely guarded by 3 men who were threatening her to make sure she followed through on some sort of deal. Tried to help the woman. She said her name was Amy and began to say she was from Virginia when she was pulled away by the men. Despite multiple claims of sightings, pictures, and new composite sketches of what Amy could look like now, she is still missing and no charges have ever been filed in her disappearance. 12 years after Amy disappeared in 1998, she was declared dead in absentia. On March 24, 2010, her family continued to pray daily that they will find out and the FBI welcome any further details regarding the case. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Amy Lynn Bradley, please contact the FBI. Alternatively, you can leave an anonymous tip online. Hannah Claire Foster was born on August 31, 1985. She lived in Southampton, England with her parents, Hilary and Trevor, and her younger sister Sarah. Hannah was a hardworking and high-achieving 17-year-old. She was completing her A-levels and was preparing to study medicine at university. Her ambition was always to be a doctor, and her teachers described her as a gifted and straight-A student that could have excelled in anything she put her mind to. Happy, smiling, and sociable, Hannah was popular amongst her peers and had a bright and promising future ahead of her. Friday, March 14, 2003. Hannah had made evening plans with her friend Helen to go out for some drinks in Southampton. After they finished their night at a bar called The Hobbit, they left together and were spotted on CCTV just before 11:15 walking down the high street. Hannah walked Helen to the bus stop, waited until she got onto the bus, said her goodbyes, and carried on walking. Hannah's house was only half a mile away, so she continued on. At around 5 a.m. and with Hannah still not home, her parents sent her a message. She always let her parents know if she had planned on staying out later than expected or if she was staying at her friend's house, and with nothing to confirm either of these were the case, her parents were deeply concerned. By mid-morning and with still no response, her father made the call to the police. With this being so out of character, the police acted quickly and their first point of call was to look into Hannah's phone. Fortunately, her phone was still on and emitting a signal. Every time her phone got a text or call from her parents, it pinged off several different locations and the police began to piece together where she might be. Panic set in when the team realized on the evening of the 14th of March a 999 call was made from her phone. When the phone call was connected to the police, it was passed on to an automated system known as the silent solutions when the operator couldn't hear any sound on the end of the phone. The system was then disconnected and there was still no response from Hannah. What also alarmed the police was that her phone was evidently moving rapidly, and this could only mean one thing. It was in a vehicle. This was further corroborated when they played and enhanced the call that was made to 999 that had lasted less than a minute. They could tell from the tape that she appeared to be in a vehicle a lot larger than a standard-sized car, and whoever was in the vehicle with her was an older male with a South Asian accent. Whoever this man was, he was ordering Hannah to keep her head down. It was obvious they were now dealing with an abduction and every moment was crucial. Signal towers put the phone between Southampton and Portsmouth in the early morning of Saturday, March 15th, but the phone was now stationary and somewhere in Portsmouth. Using cell phone towers and checking every corresponding location, just 24 hours later, people's worst fears were realized. Hannah's body was discovered in some bushes on Allington Lane on the outskirts of Southampton. She had been raped and strangled. The semen found on her clothes was put into the National DNA database but did not come back as a match with anyone. Following the signal tower pings, only a day after this awful discovery, another finding was made. In a recycling plant in Portsmouth, Hannah's bag and phone were retrieved. The hunt was now on to find the mysterious man in the veer. Using CCTV alongside the cell phone tower data, the police determined that Hannah's abductor would be linked to one of only 7 vans. The case was moving rapidly, and thanks to a huge tip, just a few days later the police would find the man they were looking for. 41-year-old Maninda Palsing Kohli was an Indian immigrant who was also living in Southampton. He was married with 2 children and worked for Hazelwood Foods as a sandwich delivery driver. Crime Watch launched an appeal using reconstructions asking for help with any information about the vans, times, or locations in question. A supervisor of Hazelwood Foods contacted the police with his suspicions surrounding Kohli. He said that his delivery route was consistent with the area in question, and when he came back to work the following day he had a scratch on his face and left early due to what he said was a bad back. The police wasted no time in following this up, and when they ran his details, they found his name was linked to one of the vans they were looking for on the CCTV footage. Cell phone tower blocks put Hannah's phone near the M27 and M275 in Hampshire, and the CCTV footage showed Kohli's van traveling down these stretches of motorway. It also showed him at the recycling center around the same time Hannah's phone stopped moving. When they located and seized his van and his place of work and inspected it, they found blood and semen in the back, both of which matched what was found on Hannah's clothes. Maninda Palsing Kohli had gone from being a person of interest to the only suspect. On March 18th, the police's case took a massive blow. They arrived at Coley's address to arrest him but found the house completely empty of everyone and everything. Coley had left the UK and traveled from Heathrow to Delhi. Coley's wife told the police he had flown out to see his dying mother and did not know when he planned on returning. Little did the police know this would set in motion a 5-year-long battle to bring Hannah's killer to justice. For just over a year, the case stood at a standstill. Indian police services weren't able to make Hannah's case a priority, and the coverage in the media was sparse and short-lived. The police wondered if Coley's immediate family might be hiding him somewhere and supporting him financially. That theory quickly faded when Coley's own father told the media that if his son had committed these crimes, he needed to face the consequences. He assured the media he would never protect him. In July of 2004, Hannah's parents, Hillary and Trevor, took matters into their own hands and made the 4,000-mile trip to Chandigarh, India to put Hannah's case on the map and locate Menendipal Singh Coley. Their heartfelt appeals would reach the ears, eyes and hearts of over 1 billion people. During the 10 days they were there, they started a telephone hotline for anyone with information about Coley and made an abundance of press conferences. Hannah's case was now firmly in the public eye and a reward of 5 million rupees was offered to anyone that could help find Coley, and by this time everyone was looking for him. A taxi driver saw Coley's face in the paper and reported to police that he had been in his cab. He told him that he was on holiday from the UK, that he worked as a delivery driver and his name was Mike. He had formed an entirely new identity and had even married another woman despite it being bigamous. In a televised interview on July 28, 2004, Coley confessed. He said he had been drinking heavily the night he abducted Hannah, and when he saw her walking down the street, he grabbed her as she went past his van. After he carried out a horrific attack on her, he said he had no choice but to kill her as she wouldn't promise to not report him. As quickly as he'd made it, he would retract this statement and claim he was forced to say it. He was held in custody in New Delhi, and the next 3 years were long and arduous. Hannah's grieving family waited on news of Coley's extradition to the UK so that justice could finally be served. In New Delhi, the case underwent 100 court proceedings and was appealed 35 times. 3 years later, in June of 2007, the call was finally made to extradite him to the UK, and as soon as Cody touched down at Heathrow Airport on the 28th of July, he was arrested and charged with kidnap, false imprisonment, rape, murder, and perverting the course of justice. But the trial would not prove simple. Despite the evidence against him, including his own admission, Coley pled not guilty, forcing Hannah's family to relive the horrors of the case. The trial began in October 2008 at Winchester Crown Court. He would later change the statement and claim he was forced to rape and kill Hannah because a gang of criminals made him do it. These protests of innocence would prove futile, and he was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 24 years. Despite Coley's relentless attempt to cover up his crimes, creating a new identity and life in another country, and his attempts to pervert the course of justice, the truth eventually caught up with him. Thanks to the tireless work of the police in both the UK and India and the incredible battle that the Foster family fought for Hannah, justice was finally served. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Chris Kremers and Liz Amfram were best friends, fellow students, and roommates from Armers Fort in the Netherlands. Liz Amfram was a positive, intelligent, and passionate young woman. She was a keen volleyball player and loved the outdoor life. Chris Kremers was 21 and was described as a creative, reliable, and responsible girl. As well as living together, they worked together at the same restaurant. Being a year ahead of Chris, Lizanne had graduated with a degree in applied sciences from Deventer, and Chris had just finished her studies in cultural and social education, specializing in art education at the University of Utrecht. The girls had spent 6 months planning and saving up for a 6-week-long trip to Panama. This would be both a vacation and a chance to expand their skills and education. They planned on spending time hiking and enjoying the views, alongside volunteering with the local children, learning Spanish and teaching the arts. This was an incredible opportunity for the young women, and they couldn't wait to get there. Chris and Lizanne boarded a plane from Amsterdam to Costa Rica, and from there they boarded a bus to Panama. On the 15th of March 2014, the girls arrived in Panama. They toured for almost 2 weeks before settling in with a local family on March 29th. Just before midday on April 1st, they took one of the host dogs named Arzel and set off for a hike near the forest that surrounded the Baru volcano. Before they left, they met for brunch with some of the other Dutch tourists and were spotted by several people around the town. They then headed to a route called the Pianista Trail not far from where they were staying. The hiking trail was popular with tourists and locals alike. With its breathtaking views and landscape, it's easy to see why. They were on social media frequently and spoke about their hiking plans for the day on Facebook. Later that evening, the dog returned home without Chris and Lausanne. There had been no contact with the girls all day. This was extremely concerning as they had both been in regular contact with friends and family via phone and social media since the start of their trip. The hosts were scared that something sinister had happened and contacted the National System of Civil Protection, or the NSBC. However, for unknown reasons, this was not followed up on straight away. The first search for the girls was actually conducted by local volunteers that knew the area well. The following morning, both girls missed an appointment that they had made with a local tour guide, and another day were passed with no sighting or word from either of them. Finally, on the 3rd of April, an official area search of the hike began. Volunteers were on the ground on foot and also searching. The trail spanned a vast area, and with a peak height of over 1,800 feet, a thorough search would take a substantial amount of time. 3 days later, the parents of Chris and Lisanne arrived in Panama to help find their daughters. Police, sniffer dogs, and the girls' parents embarked on a 10-day-long search to find them, and $30,000 was offered as a reward. The girls' parents didn't believe they would have veered off the set path, and it just didn't make any sense to them. Although police and locals were searching the area and the search moved quickly, nothing would turn up and more questions than answers arose. For 10 weeks, the case was effectively cold until one of the locals found the first key piece of evidence on June 14th. A backpack later identified as Lausanne's was found along a riverbank in Alto Romero. This was around a 14-hour walk away from the trail that the girls had embarked on. The bag was in perfect condition. It wasn't wet or damp and appeared to not have been damaged by the elements. The woman who found the bag said although she couldn't be sure how long it had been there, she was positive it couldn't have been there long as she hadn't spotted it in the days before. In the bag was $83 cash, 2 pairs of sunglasses, Lisanne's passport, Chris's medical insurance card, an empty water bottle, a camera, and both girls' bras. Also inside were Chris and Lisanne's mobile phones. Everything inside was in perfect condition, neatly packed and undamaged by the weather. The rucksack wasn't high-end or especially waterproof, and questions surrounding how the bag and the contents had stayed in such good shape in a humid and wet rainforest for the last 2 months started to be asked. There were also many sets of fingerprints found on the bag, but these were never fully analyzed, and it remains a mystery as to whose they were. Fortunately, when the phones from the backpack were switched on, they still worked perfectly. The authorities were able to start painting a picture of the hours leading up to their disappearances. Only a few hours after they set off on their hike, a call to 112 was made from Chris' iPhone 4. Dialing 112 from any country in the European Union will connect you to emergency services. 10 minutes later, Lisanne's Samsung was used to make another 112 call. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong only a few hours into the hike. On April 2nd, Lisanne and Chris made 4 more attempts to call both 112 and 911, and on April 3rd, another call to 911 was made from the iPhone. Due to the reception, only one of these calls briefly connected, and that was only for a second before it was cut off. It was clear that after 5 a.m. on April 5th, the Samsung battery eventually ran out, but Chris' iPhone continued to hold power until noon on April 11th. There were 77 attempts made to try and call the emergency services. All of these calls tragically failed. After April 6th, the passcode to the iPhone was inputted incorrectly multiple times, and it was determined that the correct PIN was never entered again. The passcode for the iPhone was entered incorrectly so many times that this possibly indicated Lisanne may have been attempting to access Chris' phone after her own battery had died, or after 8 days in the wilderness. Dehydration and hunger could have been the reason that Chris couldn't focus to enter her PIN correctly, but after over a week with what could have only been a few snacks and limited water, it was remarkable that one or both of the girls were still able to use the phone at all. On the 11th of April, the iPhone was turned on and then off for a final time at 11:56 a.m. The camera in the rucksack added more pieces to the mystery. At the beginning of their hike, they had taken a massive amount of photos of themselves overlooking the Continental Divide and happily following the trail. Nothing appeared out of place. The girls seemed happy and carefree, and it was bright and warm outside. The final photo taken in the afternoon shows Chris heading down the trail. On April 8th, a total of 90 photos have been taken, using the camera flash. These were all taken between the hours of 1 and 4 a.m. The majority were pitch black. The photos showed random areas of woodland, water, and sky. The police had several theories. Firstly, that the flash of the camera was being used to illuminate the area to guide them through. Secondly, they were using the flash to scare away wild animals that may have been encroaching. Either both or one of the women could have possibly been attempting to take photographs of distinctive parts of the forest to help lead someone to them if the phone was found. One of the images showed what appeared to be either plastic bags or wrappers stuck on some sticks on a large rock. Another photo showed what appeared to be a mirror on the ground. Alternatively, these photos could have been for themselves to get their bearings back during the daylight and help retrace their steps. The final theory is that the flash was being used to draw attention or direct anyone that may have been in the area or looking for them. There was a large search party out on the 8th of April, and flares were being shot up into the sky to try and locate the girls. The flash of the camera was possibly being used as a distress signal to lead the party to where they were. The amount of photos that had been taken looking up at the sky would further add weight to this theory. Disturbingly, one of the photographs showed the back of Chris's head with what appeared to be blood on it. This raised another theory that maybe Chris had fallen and injured herself early into the hike, and after failing to get a reception to alert the authorities, Liz Ann had left with Chris's phone to get help on foot. However, Chris may have succumbed to her injuries and Liz Ann fell victim to the elements, dehydration, or both. Out of all the images taken over the day and the early hours of the morning on April 8th, only one photo was deleted and was unable to be recovered. Image 509 in the order the photos were taken, the deleted one in question would have been around the time the flash started being used. It will never be known what this image was and why it was deleted, but it is possible that this photo could have been one of the keys to solving the case. These photos, combined with the attempts to reach help, pointed to a series of terrifying and distressing days for Chris and Liz Ann. Following the discovery of the backpack, Chris's shorts were found on a rock a few kilometers from where the bag had been located. There were inconsistencies surrounding how the shorts were found. Some reported that they were neatly folded up and others said that they had just been flung over the rock. 2 months later, a tragic finding was made. A human pelvis and a hiking boot with a foot inside was discovered. At least 33 human bones were found shortly after. They were scattered in different locations along the riverbank, almost a 12-hour walk away from where they were last known to have been. DNA tests concluded that these were the bones of Chris Kremers and Liz Ann Frun. Chris's bones were bleached presumably due to the conditions surrounding them. However, some people questioned whether or not the bleaching was down to the natural elements. Was man-made. Among these bones, the police found the remains of 3 other unidentified people. The final and remaining searches were often hindered due to bad weather, and this also meant that using cadaver dogs drew a blank. Poor weather and lots of rain makes it incredibly difficult for dogs to locate and follow scents. People speculate to this day that the girls were met with foul play, killed along the hike, and their remains were scattered over a massive area. Killed by locals, kidnapped by a gang, and even murdered by cannibals are still among the theories on the internet today. But the police say they doubted any of these theories and foul play was ruled out. Although the full picture of what happened over those 11 long days will never be known, the police believe they have come to a few conclusions. Investigators and locals found that it would have been virtually impossible to lose sight of the trail and wander off course due to how rigidly yet simply it was laid out. It was also a very popular tourist trail, so if something had happened along the way, it is fairly likely they would have been found and received help at some point. So if the girls did choose to totally go off the trail, they would have had a reason for it or deliberately taken a different turn as opposed to unknowingly making a mistake. One part of the trail, however, was seen as a potentially hazardous spot. If you leaned over too far, there was a chance for someone to slip and fall over 40 meters into the riverbank below. If you followed that same river along, this was actually where a lot of the girls' bones were discovered. A local knew the trail well and identified this area as somewhere that would have been almost impossible to get back out of should someone have fallen into it. Speculations that they had fallen into the river Calibre were squashed by the Kremers family lawyer Enrique Orocha. With no damage to the bones and the low levels of water in the river at the time they disappeared, he claimed that this just didn't stack up. A Panamanian forensic anthropologist said of the girls' remains, there are no discernible scratches of any kind on the bones. There are no marks on the bones at all. The investigating officials were come under fire for how the case was conducted. People wanted to know why it hadn't been investigated sooner and why certain things hadn't been analyzed for DNA or fingerprints. It will never be known what happened during those 11 harrowing and traumatizing days, but it is obvious that the girls fought tirelessly to save themselves and get help. Chris Kremers and Liz and From had clearly battled incredibly hard and had seemingly strategized as best they knew how. Their family and friends still search for answers and have never given up hope that they might one day find out what happened to Chris and Liz Ann on the Pianista Trail in Panama. Lauren Agee was a 21-year-old student from Hendersonville, Tennessee. She lived with her mother Sherry, stepfather Michael, and her 3 siblings. She was in her second year studying criminal science at university and has recently started a great relationship. Popular, funny, outgoing, and sporty, Lauren was thriving in all aspects of her life, and she showed a lot of promise for her future. Just a few weeks shy of her 22nd birthday, Lauren told her mother Sherry that she had been invited to go to Wakefest on the last weekend of July. Wakefest is a 3-day-long festival based at Center Hill Lake in Nashville, Tennessee. People compete in wakeboarding tournaments and water sports during the day and party and dance throughout the night. For sporty and sociable Lauren, this was an exciting opportunity, but her mom Sherry wasn't as keen on the idea. Sherry quizzed her daughter on the details, including who she would be going with. Lauren said she was going with her friend, Hannah Palmer. Sherry didn't entirely trust Hannah because of how much she was in and out of Lauren's life and felt very uneasy about the situation. However, on Friday the 24th of July, Lauren and Hannah headed off for the festival. Sherry said as soon as her daughter started walking to the car, she begged her to come back for one last hug. She told Lauren to be careful and to take care. Lauren and Hannah were on social media documenting their road trip while en route to the festival. They arrived at Wakefest in the late afternoon, and some time after the girls met up with Aaron Lilly, Hannah's boyfriend, and his friend Christopher Stout. Although the girls both knew Aaron, this was the first time they were meeting Chris. According to witnesses, Chris was attracted to Lauren and appeared glued to her, but she was in a happy relationship and she wasn't interested. They all drank, danced, and partied in the bars into the late evening. Upon the group deciding to head to bed, Lauren received a shock. She was under the impression they would be sleeping in one of the cabins or on one of the houseboats. However, for unknown reasons, the sleeping arrangements were far from that. We're in a canoe. It's a cliff on both sides. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. We're going into a trap. They were actually camping at the top of a narrow cliff that stuck out over the water. Although it was never set up to be a sleeping location, it was common knowledge amongst everyone that this was some way you could go and camp if you chose to. Over the years, festival attendees had tied a rope to the trees that led to the cliff to help people reach the top. A few other people were camping up there as well, but Lauren's group consisted of Hannah, Aaron, Chris, and another, slightly older man, Brixna Gambrill. Lauren had only packed a sleeping bag for the night, and it was evident that this new sleeping plan was not something she had prepared for. The cliff itself had a 90-foot drop down one side and an almost 50-foot drop down the other. The boys had built a tent for Hannah and Aaron to sleep in, and a hammock for Chris and Lauren. This bothered Lauren as she had already made it clear that she wasn't interested in Chris. The hammock was suspended between 2 trees over the edge of the cliff, and this was undoubtedly hazardous and dangerous. The next day, Saturday the 25th, the group headed off for some more of the same, watching the water sports, drinking, dancing, and partying. At some point during the day, the group allegedly decided to do some cliff jumping. The cliffs in the area were steep and high, and the water was filled with hidden rocks. It was alleged that when Lauren jumped, she hit the back of her head and was left unconscious for a few seconds. Despite this, Lauren seemingly recovered and appeared back to her normal self later that evening. The group carried on into the night and nothing seemed amiss. As the evening rolled round, another friend of Lauren's named Cassie Franks, who was also at the festival separately, said she bumped into Lauren's group at the bar in the marina. Cassie was also the ex-girlfriend of Aaron Lilly. She, along with many others, said it was very apparent that Aaron's friend, Chris Stout, had taken a liking to Lauren, but the feeling clearly wasn't mutual. She reported that she felt like Lauren was having to put up with Chris, almost acting as Hannah's wingman. Lauren also raised her concerns with Cassie about going back to sleep on the cliff that night. Cassie knew the fear that Lauren was feeling all too well as she had spent a night up there a few years prior. Lauren was so nervous that she asked Cassie if she could stay with her group instead. Cassie said she had to decline as they had no more room. At some point during the night, Lauren sent text to one of her friends saying that she wanted to come home and was no longer enjoying herself. She said her friends were being mean to her and she just wanted to leave. Eventually, the group decided to call it a night between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. The next morning, Hannah, Aaron, and Chris all awoke to find Lauren missing. Her belongings were all still by the hammock, but Lauren was nowhere to be seen. However, they didn't raise the alarm. They said that they had just assumed she had simply headed off down the cliff to start enjoying the day without them, but she'd left her shoes, phone, and purse. So although possible, this theory didn't seem to make much sense. Sherry was now panicking as she hadn't heard from her daughter since the Saturday and it was now Sunday. She began frantically calling and texting her daughter, but to no avail. Tragically, at 4:30 p.m. that Sunday, a fisherman and his son made a gruesome discovery. Lauren A.G. was face down and floating in the water. It was evident that she had been dead for some time. The police arrived on scene and began a recovery process. While this was happening, Aaron Lilly paddled around the corner in a canoe and went straight over to the police. He asked if they had seen his friend as she had gone missing. Harry and Deanna Elder, a couple who were also on the scene, said this encounter played on their minds. There had been no announcement to say that a body had been found in that location, and the timing of Aaron's entry onto the scene seemed odd. One of the officers on scene would later say that he believed Aaron had staged this encounter, and that the group likely already knew where Lauren's body was. Aaron, Chris, and Hannah were all brought back to the mainland and questioned. According to police, Aaron and Chris' demeanors appeared nervous. Aaron was overheard telling the others not to mention anything and to let him do the talking. Neither Aaron, Chris, or Hannah mentioned bricks, and they were all questioned individually, and the stories and accounts that the three had began to change and differ massively. Despite all of Lauren's belongings being there, Aaron Lilly claimed that she had stayed at the bar in the marina and never came back to the cliff with them. This was disputed by Detective Chris Yarchik. He was an off-duty police officer working as security for Wakefest. He remembered seeing all four of them in a canoe heading for the cliff that night, sometime around 2:30 a.m. Aaron Lilly would later change his story and said that he believed Lauren had headed off to the cliff to meet an old boyfriend. Hannah Palmer told the police that Lauren had left that morning and joined a boat of unknown people. She assumed that she had gone to spend the night with them and would return in the morning. However, during a Skype interview, Hannah would later say that she wondered if Lauren had gone to the toilet during the night and fallen off the side of the cliff. That Skype interview was interrupted by Aaron phoning Hannah, telling her to stick to the story. In Christopher Stout's written statement, he referred to Lauren as the girl and said that Lauren had returned to the campsite for only a few minutes before saying she was leaving to meet an ex-boyfriend. He said he had then fallen asleep and didn't feel her get out of the hammock that they were both in. Just one day after the festival had ended, he spoke about how good the weekend had been on Instagram, showing no signs that anything sinister had occurred. In the background of the shot, Hannah and Aaron are also visible. It remains unclear as to whether or not Snagenburl gave any form of statement. Some of the interviews were recorded and the group could be heard giving various different accounts. An autopsy was carried out and determined that Lauren's cause of death was blunt force trauma and possible drowning. She had a broken nose and fingers and her body was bruised and battered. It was also determined that she had very little water in her lungs despite being submerged. Her blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. She also had some distinctive markings and impressions on her body, including a triangle shape on her chest. Detective Chris Yarchik, who had watched her leaving that night, also helped in the recovery of Lauren's body. He said that he saw what he believed to be a bite mark on her chest as well as substantial bruising to her thighs. He suggested at the time that a rape test kit be done, but no such test was performed and her body was never swabbed for DNA. Text messages were erased and recordings of some interviews weren't made, and the crime scene was completely contaminated. It was eventually concluded that she had fallen down the side of the cliff while intoxicated and her death was ruled as an accident. It was also determined that there was no foul play involved and it was nothing more than a very tragic drunken incident. With this, DeKalb County Sheriff's Department closed the case. Sherry's gut instinct told her that this was wrong and begged for the case to be re-examined. These requests were all denied. Hannah Palmer, Chris Stout, Aaron Lilly, and Brixton Gambrill were never considered suspects by the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department. Hannah and Aaron married and moved to Florida where they had a baby. Chris Stout was in and out of jail due to various parole violations and DUIs. And Brixton Gambrill moved out of state and obtained a lawyer. None of them attended Lauren's funeral and none of them have commented or publicly engaged with the case since it closed. Cassie Franks, Lauren's friend and Aaron's ex-girlfriend, agreed with Lauren's mother Sherry, and she had concerns about what had happened that night too. She said that Aaron was violent with her during their relationship and that he had choked, bitten, and beaten her. Cassie had taken pictures of her body after these attacks and even offered them to the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department. However, they declined to look at them, stating the case was closed and Aaron wasn't a suspect. Aaron also had a history of DUIs, as did Chris Stout. Just days after Lauren had been laid to rest, Sherry received a phone call from Ryan Mallinson, an officer with the White County Police Department. He, along with Chris Yarchik, was on scene when Lauren was found. Sherry said that he told her the investigation was not handled correctly and he believed that the people she was there with were somehow involved in her death. Sherry then spoke with both he and Detective Chris Yarchik. Both were deeply concerned by the behavior they had seen from both investigators and Lauren's friends. Hannah, Aaron, and Chris continued to party for the weekend and were active on social media despite the fact that Lauren was missing. Yarchik believed that the strange triangular print upon her body was a match for the tip of a canoe, exactly like the one he'd saw them heading off to the cliff in. However, that theory was quickly thrown out by the sheriff's office. They said that the mark had been made while pulling her onto the rescue boat. Yarchik, among with many others, believed that Lauren would already died when she went into the water, which could have explained the lack of water in her lungs. However, as Yarchik wasn't an officer with the investigating department, he had no authority to reopen the case. He did, however, encourage Sherry to pursue it. By the name of Sheila Wysocki, and her first course of action was to have Lauren's autopsy notes re-examined. This second look concluded that Lauren had hemorrhaging in her throat. According to Sheila, the hemorrhaging was a result not of being strangled, but of being held down. Sheila also wanted answers from the police regarding the rape test kit and why one hadn't been carried out. The answer she received was that because Lauren had been wearing a tampon, she couldn't have been sexually assaulted. Therefore, no such test was deemed necessary. Sheila discovered that Lauren wasn't actually menstruating at the time. She contacted Lauren's GYN practitioner and they found that the lining of Lauren's uterus confirmed she hadn't been on her cycle. Sheila also disputed the details surrounding the infamous cliff jump in which Lauren supposedly hit the back of her head. She argued that while Lauren did jump off the cliff, she didn't go into the water head first, nor did she pass out, and there was no bruising. Sherry, Sheila, and Chris Yarchik also ran some experiments and tests using a 105-pound crash test dummy. The dummy was thrown off both the 90-foot side of the cliff and the 50-foot side. On the 90-foot side, the current of the water at the time wasn't consistent with where Lauren's body had been found. If she had fallen in, she would have floated towards the marina in the opposite direction. The drop on the 50-foot side was so filled with ledges, trees, and rocks that it seemed impossible to roll continuously to the bottom without something getting in the way. They used the crash test dummy almost 50 times and every time garnered the same result. A witness named Chris Brown came forward and said that he had seen who he was sure was Aaron Lilly on the night Lauren was last seen alive. He claims that at around midnight he saw Aaron coming out of the water, spluttering and spitting water out for several minutes. Aaron said they had almost drowned swimming over to the marina area. This tip was turned over to the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department and they advised that should they want to pursue this lead they would be in contact, but that call never came. His statement remains a gray area, however, as the time frame of midnight doesn't match up with the 2:30 a.m. time that the majority of witnesses talked about. During an interview with Crime Watch Daily, the family's private investigator Sheila Wysocki said that she had been following up on some false stories that had been circulating around social media. She said some of the information was coming from an IP address in Florida matching the same street that Hannah and Aaron's house was on. Sheila and Sherry believed that this was no coincidence. Sheila was convinced that the answers lay with Hannah Palmer. Aaron, in December of 2016, Lawrence's family filed a $10 million wrongful death lawsuit against the four of them in a bid to force them to talk. Aside from Chris Stout, they all ended up pleading the Fifth Amendment. Because Chris Stout was in jail at the time, pleading the Fifth may have impacted his sentence, so he took part in a deposition. This lawsuit also highlighted a lot of flaws in the handling of the case, and officers were forced to admit that a lot more could and should have been done. In March of 2017, Sherry's wrongful death lawsuit against the group was dismissed, ruling that there was insufficient evidence. Circuit Court Judge Jonathan Young threw the case out, deeming it to be ridiculous and pulled out of thin air. Sherry was told that it may only be possible to proceed if she agreed to a gagging order, preventing her from talking about the case publicly, something she felt would hinder rather than help. Opinions were not based on any relevant scientific methods, processes, and data and seemed to be just pulled out of the thin air. The court finds that the plaintiff has not proved any shred of evidence that anyone intentionally harmed Ms. Agee. After the lawsuit was thrown out, over 20,000 people signed a petition begging for the case to be reopened. At the start of 2019, the Nashville Court of Appeals overturned the ruling made regarding Hannah Palmer's potential involvement in the case. It was unanimously clearly erroneous assessment of the evidence. The court ruled that Sherry absolutely had a clear and legal right to sue for wrongful death. Despite all of this, the case currently sits in limbo, and Lauren's family and Sheila Wysocki continue their fight for answers and justice for Lauren Agee. At this stage, it is unknown whether or not the full story about what happened that night will be brought to light, but Sherry Smith is determined to fight for her daughter for as long as it takes.